And then we do want to be taking just polar bear questions too, questions about the area. Okay, so here's one right now from Iso Forelli. Is the ice on track as far as timing for the bears to get out there to hunt? That's a really good question. It's hard to say for sure if the ice is on track. So the ice here is forming later than it used to compared to about 30, 40 years ago. We are hoping the ice starts forming, anytime now would be great. Usually we see it by mid-late November, but in some years it's been as late as mid-December in this region. So the weather's cool. There's snow on the ground, which is nice. It's been we don't always get snow in October on the ground out here. We've had a few brown Octobers out here recently. So we'll just keep our eye on the bay. There are also some ice maps that we can post in the comment section, which are really great. So we'll pull some of those and you can look at some daily ice maps and kind of watch as the ice comes into Hudson Bay. I'd say we're at least a couple weeks out, but, it's hard to know for sure. And maybe Jeff can add on to my comments there and fill us in. And then, talk a bit broadly about why a tool like radar might be useful in the north.
Sure. Thanks, Elisa. Yeah, on the sea ice, and these things are directly related this year. We were hopeful because it looked like the ice might come in quite early. A couple of weeks ago, it got bitter cold here on the bay in the southern, southwestern part. And we were even seeing grease ice form along the shore here. And if you look more regionally, sort of the central Canadian Arctic, we're still running at about a 10-year high for ice. So at least to the north of us, that's good news for some of those bears up there. And linking that back to the radar project and sort of polar bear human conflict more broadly, the reason we're testing this technology here is that across the Arctic, more polar bears are spending more time on shore. And that puts them at direct risk of bumping into people and getting into trouble. So we're trying to stay ahead of the curve. We're trying to take lessons learned from brown and black bear conflict work and other predator conflict work around the world. Bring that information and those lessons to the north and to try to stay ahead of the issue and make sure both people and polar bears are safe. Whether it's people living in the north, working in the north, or people visiting the north, checking things out. So that's where the spotter project comes in. And this is, I think, as BJ may have said, it's sort of military technology that's being repurposed for peaceful uses now, where we're applying this really fine-scale radar system to detect targets, in our case, polar bears moving on the land, particularly in the dark or in poor weather where, human visibility might miss them. And then ideally to remotely alert people to the presence of bears. So it could be a conservation officer, could be a tour guide, somebody that's responsible for safety in a community as well. And later in the project, we hope to also test its ability to automatically or remotely trigger some deterrence, things like a strobe light or generating a sound that might cause the bear to think twice about coming any closer to a site where the radar is fixed. So we'll see how that all shakes out, but that's kind of the gist of why we're doing it.
We've got a great question that came in. Has there been any historical research that identified how Native communities protected people from bears in pre-electronic times?
Sure. The little bit I'm familiar with is from Russia. So in the Russian Far East, the part that's closest to Alaska, the coastal people there are the Chukchi people that live in Chukotka. And historically, they've lived with polar bears as long as they've been around. So they actually still use some of these same older techniques today because they lack options. They live in a very remote part of the world. It's quite difficult to get there, and it's quite difficult and expensive to get tools there. In Russia, things like a 12-gauge shotgun that we might take for granted here in North America, both for protection and to use for what we call non-lethal deterrence. Up here, they call them cracker shells or bear bangers. They're just not available in Russia. So in the case of the Chukchi people, they use still kind of their first line of defense is a 2-meter long pole that you'll see their bear patrol folks hold out in front of them. And I've had them tell me part of it for them is they say the bears perceive this pole held out in front of you as a giant walrus tusk. And since walrus can be potentially dangerous and can cause lethal wounds to polar bears, the bear kind of thinks twice about getting closer. The people I've talked to, and it's both men and women in Russia that are also very experienced being around bears and, with polar bear behavior from just years and years of observation. Worst case scenario for them, they'll use the pole to whack the bear on the nose. That's how close they sometimes get to a bear, which I don't recommend anyone try at home there. So, yeah, they definitely still use some of the techniques there. And the same is true for them when they're hunting seals or fishing out on the ice. They have certain techniques that they've used for millennia to try to make sure they don't become a polar bear's next meal when they're out there.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm just taking a look at some of your guys' snapshots from today, and I see that bear that had like almost a growth or mole looking thing on its nose. We haven't seen that one up close yet, so we'll keep an eye out at the lodge. It's an interesting looking nose he's got there. So we'll take a look. What do you guys think that is? Could just be some gunk or some. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll watch for him. He's pretty identifiable. And identifying polar bears it's helpful when they have markings or scars. So as BJ mentioned, the guy we're seeing on Buggy 1 right now is missing an ear. So that's pretty, obvious. We've also had a couple of bears, usually the males who do the fighting get more scars. So if they have a really obvious scar, which we've seen a few of them around, we get to know a little bit about who they might be. But it can be pretty tricky if the bear doesn't have markings. It's hard to tell polar bears apart otherwise. So with that, we do have a question. How many bears do you usually get in a year? I'm sure you have some that come back year after year that you get to know. Maybe BJ could answer this one, as this is his, 12th year, 13th year on the Tundra, something like that?
11, something like that. Anyways, there was a bear here that they had nicknamed Dancer. He had a X scar on one side of his nose, and so he was really easy to spot. Also, this bear was pretty remarkable in that he seemed to have almost a calendar in his back pocket there, because he showed up almost every single year within a 4 or 5 day period here at the lodge. So that was pretty interesting. They named the bear Dancer, and this is going back to the early days of the polar bear cam here on Buggy 1. So, I didn't have a lot of years with Dancer. He was probably just maybe my first 4 or 5 years, maybe he was out here. So really a unique bear and just a really big animal. So, there are a few that we're maybe able to identify. Of course, it's mostly the buggy drivers and things that are naming these bears. Scientists don't name the bears. They put ear tags in the bears and give each bear a number. So we would love to be able to read each of these ear tags from the buggy. It would be really pretty neat to tell who's who and kind of where they were each captured last and things like that. But of course, you got to get a little close for comfort to read those ear tags.
Thanks for that, BJ. One thing we also have seen today, which is pretty neat, is one of the bears, and I believe he is on the south cam right now, though apparently my computer's on a bit of a delay. But we've got a bear that seems to have maybe found a bone or a piece of a carcass of something and has been chewing on it very happily for a while, which is kind of neat to see. Whether it feels good in he's probably not getting a lot of nutrition, but it probably feels good in his mouth and tastes good and something fun to chew on. Another guest we have on board with us right now is Dr. Greg Tiemann, who is a professor of environmental studies at York University and one of the leading researchers in polar bear diets, and is very fascinating to talk to. So, Greg, I was wondering if you could tell us, I don't even know if I have a directed question, but I just find I think it's very fascinating that we see bears out here at this time of year, maybe eating kelp, maybe chewing on twigs or bones they find, but that's not really their normal diet. Could you talk a little bit about what polar bears are eating now versus maybe on the sea ice? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Elisa. It's a great privileged to be out here right now by the Tundra Buggy Lodge and seeing bears in their terrestrial habitat during the ice-free season. Their preference, of course, would be to be out on the sea ice, and in parts of their range where the ice is maintained year-round, bears will stay on that ice and hopefully be successful in feeding year-round. And when they're out on the ice, what they're primarily aiming for through most of their range is ring seal. That is their key prey source. They'll also feed on bearded seals and other marine mammals as they're available. But ring seals really are the staple of their diet, and they are key to amassing the fat stores that bears need to survive these periods of onshore, the onshore phase of their lives during the ice-free period. And when they're onshore, they're curious. They're bears. They're going to do as bears do and check things out. When they find things to eat, they're going to eat them. A couple of the key things that polar bears consume during the ice-free period is macroalgae, kelp, seaweed. It washes up in these huge quantities. Bears will bed down in it. They'll roll around in it. They'll eat it. They'll also eat large quantities of grass. We know from some biochemical analyses that bears don't really seem to get a lot of nutrition out of these food sources. They don't really seem to be incorporated into their tissues. They're not really using them, it seems, for growth. But they're obviously fulfilling some kind of need that the bears have. But what the bears onshore, as evidenced from the polar bear cams, is they're primarily saving energy. They're waiting for that sea ice to reform so that they can go back out. And so we've been locked onto this one bear it's been a couple hours that he's just been curled up in a ball. He occasionally rolls over and stretches and readjusts and looks around and then goes back to sleep. So this is really their key objective during this time of year, is to save as much energy as they can. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. I'm sure I'll pop back over to you in a few moments here to ask you a couple more questions. But we did have one that just came in that I'd love to hand over to Jeff, because he is kind of the policy go-to guy at PBI. So we've got another question from Iso Forelli. Has the new DC admin's environmental policies affected your efforts to monitor bear activity and to keep them alive? Excellent question. Jeff.
Sure. No, that is a really good question. I'll back up a little bit and say we were pretty excited a couple of years ago when countries around the world got together in Paris and came to an agreement to take action on climate that would head us in the right direction. It definitely wasn't everything we need to do, but it was a huge step in the right direction with leadership from France and the EU and others to bring that all together. Since then, unfortunately, we've had a pretty big shift in the political direction of the U.S. federal government, and the current administration has, of course, sort of suspended their engagement with that process and has been actively sort of rolling back some of the things that we should be doing in the U.S. regarding taking aggressive actions on climate and just showing global leadership there as well. So in that sense, we're definitely not helping polar bears, or the current DC administration is not doing their part to tackle the biggest problem, which is climate change and that habitat and sea ice loss. Fortunately, here in Canada, there's a different political vibe going on, and Canada is showing global leadership. They just passed a national carbon tax just last week. And so that administration is stepping up and showing the kind of leadership we need to protect polar bears into the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. And that's a really good place where I can reiterate the overall theme of today's live chat was going to be about connecting polar bears to people. And that's something that it's so easy to do, and it's kind of just inherent. We have a shared future, and anything we're doing to help polar bears is, at the end of the day, it's helping ourselves. So protecting the sea ice, protecting polar bears means protecting future generations of everything that relies on the healthy planet to keep us all going and living great lives. So I would love to take this opportunity to pop over to the last person you have not spoken to yet on Buggy One at the moment. I would like to introduce you to Liam O'Doherty, and he works at Taking It Global, who is one of our largest education partners. We love working with Taking It Global. They do some fantastic work across the planet, and especially across the north, which to us is so important. We want to make sure we're talking to the folks that are living in the north and the kids that are even living with polar bears, and staying connected, and Taking It Global helps us do that. Liam, could you give folks a brief overview of the great work that you guys are doing?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's really exciting to be out here on the tundra today, and in particular to be connecting with two of our Connected North schools from Skagdane and Sioux Lookout. And so these schools are part of a program that we run called Connected North. And essentially what we're doing is providing enriching education opportunities for 40 different communities in the Canadian North. And for us, it's really important to listen and engage with Indigenous communities and learn from their perspectives, and also to share some of the science that's happening here outside of Churchill, and to ensure that communities that live with polar bears have the opportunity to find out more about them, and to share their perspectives and engage with all the amazing work that's happening here. There's actually a second program that we're also working on that engaged in the United Nations Climate Change Conference that was spoken a little bit about before, and the Paris Agreement, and that one's called Decarbonize, Decolonize. And the idea with that program is essentially to explore the intersections of Indigenous worldviews and climate change. And for us, it's really important not to only pursue market-based solutions, and also to look at kind of Indigenous worldviews and how can we adjust and align our perspectives about the planet and how we engage with it and how we respect it, so that we don't just put a price on carbon, but also fundamentally look at and reevaluate our relationship with the Earth and with each other. And I feel like polar bears are a really excellent kind of key marker species that by protecting them and protecting the sea ice and their habitat will also be protecting the future of our life on this planet. And so really when we zoom out, all of these things are so connected, and the amazing technologies that we have available to us allow us to build global networks and learn new perspectives and engage with different ideas. And we see ourselves as playing a small part in this and connecting all these amazing things. And so it's a great honor to be here today.
Thank you so much, Liam. At Polar Bears International, we think researching polar bears is really important. Bringing them to you and inspiring a love for them is really important. And then, of course, educating folks and making sure that people have a chance to learn about polar bears and, build their love for them. And we feel like the more you know and care about an animal, the more you can do to help protect the animal. And a lot of that starts by reaching kids and students across the world, the next generation that's going to inherit our planet. And our educational partners just play such an important role in our work, so we really appreciate that. So we're about halfway through our live chat, so I just want to back up for 2 seconds and give more context to where we are. So we are east of Churchill. We are on the tundra, a very cool ecosystem up here in Churchill. It's kind of 3 ecosystems combined in a way. We're on the edge of the boreal forest, we're on the tundra, and then of course there's a marine environment, so it's a pretty cool place to see. We are in a roaming mobile broadcast studio, basically, on our Tundra Buggy 1. And we are just, to the side of the Tundra Buggy Lodge right now, which is also right on the coast of Hudson Bay here. And so you'll see a Lodge South and a Lodge North cam if you're on explore.org. And we are on the Tundra Buggy cam. And then there are also 2 polar bear cams out east of here. And Yes, so there's great questions about Halloween. No, wonderful questions. So tomorrow, we're very excited, is Halloween. It's going to be a lot of fun. We do have an educational webcast midday if anyone's interested in tuning in. It's mostly aimed at students, but it's going to be pretty fun. It's called Polar Bear Spies. We're going to talk about cool technology we use to study polar bears. And then in the afternoon, we have one called Polar Boos. And boo is in scary, not as in the other kind. It's going to be fun too. We're going to talk about, what is it like to live in Churchill on Halloween? We got to get those kids out, getting their candy and chocolate. How do we keep them safe? It is definitely a unique challenge. So stay tuned tomorrow for that. Lots of fun. I will take another look at your questions here. And yeah, for those of you just joining, so we are pretty close to a sleeping polar bear. This bear is, it's kind of hard to tell. He's in his little kelp bed right now, but this is a large male. And we know that because he is one we did see up close last night. It can be very hard to identify polar bears if you're not up close. It can be hard to tell males and females apart. So the only reason we're confident about this guy is that we did see him very up close last night when we were at the lodge for dinner. We know he's missing an ear. And we know he's very good size and he's got some distinguishable markings. So we'll see if he gets up earlier for you. He has been doing some stretching and polar bear yoga, which has been very neat to watch. And we're keeping an eye out our windows for other bears. This morning was a lot of bear activity, lots around the lodge. I think we saw about 10 altogether, which was pretty great for a couple hours. They're taking maybe a little lunch siesta here. And then we're going to keep roaming around this afternoon to find you more bear activities. So one question I wanted to get to is one that we've seen pop up a couple times in the last few days, and I'm going to pass this over to Greg. Greg, why would we not at this point want to put feeding stations around the tundra to keep these bears going until the ice gets back?
Well, that's a great question. And, based on what we know about polar bears and their habitat needs and their conservation status, we do need to start thinking about action that we can take and sometimes unconventional action that may be required. In the case of polar bears around Churchill and the possibility of feeding stations or supplemental feeding, that is food that's provided by people to help animals get through times of scarcity, is probably not entirely feasible for bears around here for a few reasons. One is that, the primary threat that polar bears face is a lack of sea ice habitat, and just adding more food from people, probably, commercial dog chow is what it would likely have to be on some kind of commercial scale, wouldn't address that fundamental underlying conservation issue of climate-driven sea ice loss. It would also be extraordinarily expensive. Some colleagues have run analyses on what that kind of operation would look like, and the cost may be up to $1 million a month for feeding a population scale of bears. And, it would be an approach that would commit human intervention to keeping animals in this habitat extended far enough you could see it as, almost a ranch style approach to wildlife management, where animals become dependent on human intervention. And that's not what we love about polar bears. It's not what we want to see in a future with polar bears. What we want to see is them doing the things that they've done for hundreds of thousands of years, living on the sea ice as integral parts of the Arctic marine ecosystem.
Thanks, Greg. And I have another question for you here, if you don't mind. Also, Jerry York says hi. Might be a relative. Yeah. Okay, Greg. So there has been a bit of work that has looked at this question. Is there a timeline, approximate date month, where the polar bears might be so delayed getting out on the ice that they could starve to death?
Well, polar bears face a couple of issues in parts of their range where they face an ice-free season, and that occurs on both ends of that season. So when the ice breaks up early, it makes it harder for them to catch seals during the most important time of the year, which is in the spring and early summer when ring seals are most productive and they're producing pups. And so that early breakup really inhibits their ability to accumulate fat that they need to survive the ice-free period. So what we end up seeing is in years with early breakup, bears coming ashore in poorer condition. That is, they're skinnier. They have less fat on their bodies. And then if we, at the same time, extend that ice-free period into the fall, then we're asking them to fast for longer with less fuel on their bodies. So, there is a possibility that we extend that ice-free fasting period too long for some bears to survive. Every year there will be bears, typically old bears, that just don't have the body condition to survive the onshore fast. And as we extend that fast, we increase the proportion of the population that will be at mortal risk of starvation. We also know that bears, even after the sea ice returns, can face some pretty poor feeding conditions through a lot of the winter. The winter in the Arctic is dark, the ice is thick, the seals are hard to find, and so even though polar bears through the winter may be on the ice and actively feeding, actively hunting that is, they may not be getting a whole lot of nutrition. And it's really that spring feeding period that's crucial to their survival through much of the rest of the year.
Thank you so much, Greg. We have a couple more questions coming in. How far is the bay expected to freeze typically? Is it as large as miles or kilometers? And maybe BJ can handle this one.
Sure. So they call the Hudson Bay a seasonal ice ecoregion. And what they mean by that is that if you look at the cam now, as we pan up and over the water there, you'll see that it's totally open. And every summer, this is the way things end up and have ended up. And the bears in this population have evolved to cope with that. About this time of year, as we're starting to see, there's some ice beginning to form. And at some point this winter, the bay will pretty much freeze all the way across. You know, I don't think you could put on a set of ice skates and skate across the bay. It's not frozen like a lake. It's pretty dynamic environment out there. There's going to be, leads that open up and places where pressure ridges form. And so it really is probably more like maybe a white lunar landscape, maybe. It's going to be pretty jumbled. Maybe we can try to throw some pictures of what that looks like. Now that's good polar bear habitat there. So it freezes pretty much all the way across.
Cool. Thanks, BJ. So there are 4 different ecoregions across the Arctic, which is pretty cool. And like BJ said, this is a seasonal one. So polar bears in different areas of the world, which is 19 populations and 5 countries, Alaska, US, Canada, Norway, and Greenland. They all kind of might have different sort of life histories, like patterns throughout the year, when they're going on the ice, when they're coming back, how things are changing will be at different rates, maybe slight changes in prey species that are available in certain areas. Hudson Bay is, look at the map. It's pretty incredible that whole thing freezes up. And if you are interested in where the bears are moving throughout the winter, please be sure to check out the Polar Bears International Bear Tracker, and maybe we can pop a link into that comment box. But we do track a subset of polar bears in the Western Hudson Bay population throughout the winter. We update it weekly, and so you can get an idea of where these bears are moving over the sea ice in this area. It is pretty incredible to see. Okay, Jeff, got another question for you. Do polar bears hibernate?
Sure. Yes, polar bears do hibernate, but not all polar bears hibernate. So unlike some of their other bear relatives, only pregnant females go out and create dens. Here in the southern part of the range, across the southern part of Hudson Bay, so both in western and southern Hudson Bay, bears go into the boreal forest and they find peat features, banks, pulses, and they dig into the earth much like you would see a brown or black bear do there, and then are drifted over. In the rest of the Arctic, adult female polar bears dig snow caves. So they look for places where snow accumulates and where snow is persistent throughout the winter. And that varies depending on where. In coastal Alaska, that's along shore where there's tall peat banks that collect snow, along river banks, around lakes. And in other parts of the world that are more hilly or mountainous, that can be fairly high up, some fairly steep slopes. I know we see that in Svalbard with our den monitoring work, and I've seen at least one female in Alaska den at about 5,000 feet in the Brooks Range. So they're pretty creative when they need to be.
Thanks for that, Jeff. We got another cool question. It was actually a little earlier, but I kept it. So I keep a running list of questions I see come in that I try to get to at the time and then save for later. Or if I can't get to them, then I want to make sure I answer them. We did get a question a while ago about how do polar bears not go snowblind? How are they not like losing their vision out there? If you've ever been out in the winter and it's just white and it's bright and that ice and snow are reflecting and you get an accidental suntan in the middle of winter, then you know what I'm talking about. Polar bears do have a third kind of eyelid called a nictitating membrane in their eye. And that might be something you also see if you have like a house cat. You've seen that kind of extra eyelid flick over their eye, and polar bears can use that to make sure that they're not going snowblind. And now I can't get too much deeper than that, but we're going to dig up some better information for you and we'll post it because it's pretty cool. It's a pretty neat feature they have because it would be very difficult out there to see in the ice and snow. But you know, that reflectivity of the ice and snow is one of the reasons that Arctic sea ice is so important to the planet. Arctic sea ice acts like the Earth's air conditioner because it does reflect all that sunlight away from the Earth. So the sunlight's coming in, hits that ice, and it's bouncing back out of the atmosphere, or trying to. And that helps keep us all cool by not absorbing that sunlight into the Arctic Ocean. Pretty cool stuff. Arctic sea ice is so neat. We're going to be talking about it throughout the year. We talk about Arctic sea ice a lot with students because it's such a great ecosystem that can be used in classrooms. It's a fascinating environment. It looks like BJ was saying before, you know, it's broken, it's white, it's so cool. It's like the surface of the moon. We'll try to post some photos in the comments for you. And it can look like there's nothing going on, but if you're ever able to peek under sea ice, it's like this underwater, upside down garden. It is so cool. There's in the cracks that forms in sea ice as it freezes, the salt makes these channels in the ice, and up in all those cracks, there's algae forming in there. The algae is absorbing sunlight through the ice. And that algae is feeding the whole base of the food chain. So it's kind of acting like soil would in a forest. And it's supporting this whole base that polar bears are at the top of. And so they're so intertwined, and all the species in between. We've got, you know, copepods, we've got fish, we've got seals and whales, of course, and polar bears at the top. So we just think their ecosystem is so special and so important to protect for ourselves and for polar bears and all the animals that rely on that area. And we talked a bit about it today, that we can do that by making sure that we're moving to more sustainable energies. We're electing leaders that care about that sort of thing and want to make sure that our future is, you know, bright and stable for all of us. This carbon in the atmosphere is just hanging on to too much heat, and we can lessen that heat trapping blanket by using other types of energy from nature. Solar, wind, there's things we can be doing and we know how to do, which is pretty great. So our bear moved a little bit. It's so funny when they have these extended naps. Like Greg mentioned earlier, you know, they're fasting, they're conserving energy. They're trying not to waste a lot of energy that They don't need to. They have to hold on to their body fat, and they lose approximately a kilogram a day when they're out here, based on some research that was done on fasting rates of polar bears. So when they're on land, they are losing weight, and that's part of why they have to come on land so fat and hopefully happy. So the spring is a major hunting time for polar bears, where hopefully they can really fatten up, and that fat in the seasonal ice areas will last them through the summer. So when polar bears do come ashore in July, we hope that they are in really great shape, which means that they could last into this time of year. So they do go quite a while without feeding, which is pretty cool. But, pregnant females in this population, they're in dens right now, and they're not going to come out until about March, late February, early March. And then they'll head to the sea ice with their new cubs. And if you do the math, these females go for up to 8 months without eating, which is just crazy. But they do it, and it's so amazing that they're adapted for this lifestyle. But again, this means that they do need to be eating very well while they can, and gaining a lot of weight and eating that marine blubber. A diet of berries and eggs just wouldn't cut it for these bears that really rely on these fat stores, and they're meant to eat fat. So this is an interesting question from NASCAR 78 fan. And Jeff, I'm going to pass this one to you, and maybe Greg can chime in. So here's the question. I have read that the Inuit people treasure the spirit bear. If they hunt whales and seals, could they be a source of supplemental feeding during the difficult periods for the polar bears, possibly share their bounty with the bears that they are so fond of?
Sure. No, that's an interesting question, Elisa. So I'm going to take that kind of broadly as a supplemental feeding question, which Greg did touch on a little bit earlier. And while we do use that tool for some wildlife management scenarios, and just to give a quick example, it's been used with bears in North America. So in the U.S. West, in the Rocky Mountains, in places where they might have a bad year for a certain kind of crop there that bears focus in on. To keep bears from coming down out of the mountains and into communities, they may supplementally place food out on the land for those bears to get and keep them up in the woods where they belong and out of people's backyards. A big difference here is that's a short-term problem. That's getting a population of bears through kind of an acute but time discrete situation. We're looking at a long-term global phenomena, and we're looking at a situation too that, unless we act, is only worsening at present. And even when we act, there'll be long-term repercussions of the energy we've already put into the climate system. So this wouldn't be about feeding bears for a year or 2 years or 3 years. It would be about feeding bears potentially for decades. And that brings up a whole host of problems with habituation. It brings up sort of ethical, social issues of, are they even wild bears anymore if you're, intervening at that level? And it also brings up some issues with sourcing of food that would be appropriate and disease transmission, just to name a few with that. So it's problematic. The sentiment is right. Like, what can we do to help the bears? But, what we like to redirect people is, the real problem is keeping the sea ice around and addressing climate warming. And while there are going to be some short-term management things we need to do, we've really got to focus the bulk of our attention, our innovation, our creativity on dealing with climate change and the resulting loss of sea ice.
Would you be able to speak just briefly to the unique situation that Kaktovik is in with the whalebone piles, and how that's maybe changed over the last 5 to 10 years with polar bears coming in?
Sure. So Kaktovik, Alaska is a small Inupiaq community on the border with Canada. So it's in Alaska's far northwest. And like most other Inupiaq communities across Alaska, it's a community that participates in bowhead whale harvest for food. And as you could imagine, bowhead whales weigh about a ton a foot. So a 30 or 40 foot whale is 30 to 40 tons of meat, in this case, once it's harvested for food. And even when used most efficiently, there's going to be some remains behind, and Kaktovik has become much more successful more frequently in taking their quota of whales for the community, in part due to that very loss of sea ice. So when I started working in Alaska, first year I was in the Arctic was 1991. I was on a small boat-based crew, and we couldn't get past Kaktovik because the ice was up against the shore at the community. So in past years, Kaktovik may not have been able to go out and even attempt to harvest whales in some years because of ice. Fast forward to today, and that sea ice near Kaktovik can be, 300-400 miles offshore. So there's plenty of open water to get out and participate in that activity. The bears have figured this out pretty quickly. Polar bears first, brown bears not too long after, and they definitely take advantage of those extra marine calories. They are in the right form for them. It's a natural food in kind of an unnatural setting, you might say. But there are, without question, a group of bears that have benefited from that site-specific supplemental food source.
Great. So we've got just a couple more questions. Jeff, I'll pass one quick off to you, and then Liam, we've got some coming in from Connected North, which is fantastic. So how do the ships that are going through the Arctic right now, are they impacting the polar bears?
So with ships, I would say, in part, we don't know. As shipping has increased, there needs to be some monitoring that goes along with that. From what we do know about polar bears, it's not an area or an activity that we have a lot of concern about, at least at the level that's occurring now. The physical presence of ships, sort of the noise they might make on the surface at least, isn't as big of a deal for polar bears as it would be for whales or seals under the water. So it could definitely have impacts and change the behavior of polar bear prey, which could then have follow-on effects to bears. The bigger issue for polar bears with shipping would be accidents. It would be, something where a ship goes aground and oil is spilled, and then to a lesser extent, the management of ballast and wastewater on ships. Are they potentially sources of new diseases, bacteria, things like that in a fairly or historically pristine Arctic environment? So there are some small concerns that could become large if not properly managed and looked after. But the good news there is that's one area that the Arctic Council, which is the group of all of the Arctic nations, they get together and talk about these things. It's one they're actively looking at, and they have been discussing several management options to make sure some of the worst case scenarios don't happen.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So we'll just take a couple more questions from Connected North, and then in a little bit, I think we'll probably mosey on with Buggy One and try to find you guys maybe a bear that isn't taking such a long nap today, even though he's very great. I personally have been distracted. There's a couple ravens outside our window digging through the kelp, which has been highly entertaining during this whole chat. Pretty great. Lots of cool stuff to see out here. So thanks so much for the Connected North School for sending in your questions. I'll answer a couple and then I'll pass a couple off, and then we're going to wrap up. So how old are the baby polar bears? Well, polar bears are born in the winter, and we just assign polar bears a birthday of January 1st every year, even though it might be a little bit earlier than that or maybe a little bit later. And when the polar bears are ready to leave their den, when the babies are ready, they're about 2 months old, maybe a little more than 2 months old, and they're not very big. They weigh maybe between 20 and 30 pounds or something like that. And usually 1 to 2 cubs are born at a time, though sometimes there are triplets, 3 cubs born at one time. And the mom feeds the babies this very, very rich milk. So polar bears have very fatty milk. It's kind of like us drinking whipping cream, which is pretty crazy. So that's how they grow so big so fast, because when they're born, they're only about a pound. So if you think about when you were born, you weighed maybe 7 pounds, and 2 months later, I bet you didn't weigh 70 pounds, but polar bears can grow 10 times their body weight in just a couple months, which is pretty darn cool. So baby polar bears are definitely something that we like to talk about. And as for hunting, polar bears have a couple ways they hunt. They do rely on sea ice to hunt their main prey, seals. So most of the time, polar bears are going to need sea ice to get a good meal. They can either find a seal hole and wait really patiently beside the hole for a seal to eventually come up and breathe, because seals have to breathe air even though they swim underwater. And when a seal comes up for air, a polar bear can pounce in the hole, grab the seal, and pull it up onto the sea ice to eat it. Or polar bears can sneakily stalk their seal prey. So seals do have to come up on the ice to rest sometimes. And if a polar bear is really sneaky, then he might be able to sneak up on the seal and grab it before it can get back in the water. So those are two main ways that polar bears hunt. But they also might scavenge sometimes. So they might eat leftovers that are on land or that another bear ate. And this could be all sorts of different things, which kind of ties into one of your questions. Do polar bears eat narwhals? That's a really great question. And I'm going to pass that one off to our feeding expert.
Thank you. That is a great question, and the short answer is not very much. We've done some analyses of polar bear diets across the Canadian Arctic, and we find a little bit. We find some evidence that polar bears eat a little bit of narwhal, and most of that probably comes from scavenging, as Elisa suggested. Scavenging narwhal whales that have died of natural causes, or narwhals that have been taken in the Inuit subsistence harvest, and there are remains left on the beach. As we've talked about already, polar bears feed primarily on ring seals and on bearded seals. If there's a small whale that they rely on most, it would be probably the beluga whale, which tend to be quite abundant in Canadian Arctic waters and occupy a similar kind of near shore habitat, frequently coming into the shallows at several parts of the year, where they become potentially available for polar bears. Belugas and narwhals will also occasionally become entrapped in a small area of open water during the ice-covered season. So you could have a potentially large group of whales that are continually surfacing for air in one small pocket of open water, and they either don't know about or can't reach the next space of open water. So they can potentially get stuck in these entrapments, and that's a potential rich feeding source for polar bears to even grab a whale and pull it out. And at that case, in those circumstances, when that happens, you can have very large aggregations of bears come and share the whales.
Interesting stuff. Thanks so much, everybody on the buggy today, for answering those questions. We just love talking about polar bears, and we're so grateful and fortunate that we're able to do that as often as we are. And we feel very blessed to be here on Buggy One next to the polar bears. And we're going to wrap up here right now. We're going to maybe mosey on down the buggy lane here and see what else there is to see on the tundra today. And then we're going to be talking to you tomorrow as well. So again, we do have a webcast midday at noon Central for students, but anyone can join, about cool technology. And then at, I believe it is 3 p.m. Central tomorrow afternoon, we have a Halloween special, which will be super fun. Come learn how Churchill deals with Halloween. How do you trick or treat when there are polar bears outside? Pretty interesting. It should be a really fun day tomorrow. And absolutely stay tuned this evening. You know, even if we're off hours and no one's around, the polar bears are still around. So late last night, we saw some great sparring off the Lodge North Cam. We were all ready to go to bed, and there was some polar bear activity, so it was pretty cool. So definitely check the polar bears out anytime. All fall. We'll be here for about another at least 3 weeks or so, depending on how long the polar bears stick around. So we really look forward to continuing to chat with you and take your questions and talk about polar bears and hang out with polar bears all day. So thank you, everybody, for your time and your interest, and have a great rest of your afternoon. We'll be rolling soon. Bye.